Hey everyone, thanks for your time this afternoon. Certainly thanks to Mo and team for the invite to speak here today. My name's Andy Knepp, and I do work for Bayer Crop Science. What I'm going to talk about today is really not a lot about Bayer Crop Science. I'll maybe say a few things at the front end here, but maybe relative to some of the other presentations from some of the people that work in private industry. This really today for us isn't about what we're doing at Bayer Crop Science. It isn't about our products. It isn't about our technology per se. It's about technology in agriculture, and it's about the opportunity in agriculture when we think about what's happening, some of the major issues and trends that we see. I think Arana did a really good job yesterday of kind of talking about some major macro trends, right? What's happening with population growth, what's happening with the amount of arable land per person, what's happening to our environment. And these are all huge challenges that we as a crop science company take very seriously, and something that we certainly want to say, how do we make sure that as was mentioned earlier, that we represent ag as part of the solution to the problem. I've got a good friend and colleague named Dr. Jeff Seal, who's been really instrumental in a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about. And Jeff's a little bit of a smart aleck, and he always says, hey, look, in order to make sure you're on the road to recovery, you got to admit that you're a problem, or that you admit that you have a problem. And I think that's really fair for us in agriculture to say, hey, look, there's some wonderful things that we do in agriculture. There's amazing technology. Certainly, as you think about, to me, nothing more noble than feeding the world. Certainly we know that agriculture has an impact on the environment, and to the extent that we work to make sure that we're addressing those issues, it creates a really huge opportunity for agriculture. So as just a background on me, I'm actually an agronomist by training. I spent a huge part of my career working hand in hand with farmers in product development, trying to provide them tools and technologies and resources, knowledge, information to help them better at what they do. And so it's been an awesome part of my career, and really just as a way to kind of underpin the value and the role of technology in agriculture and what it's done in terms of production, what it's done in terms of our ability to produce more with fewer resources. I'm actually going to talk about my wife. So I come from kind of a multi-generational farm family, although it's been kind of broken and I'm not in agriculture as a farmer. My wife's family still farms. She also comes from a multi-generational farming family. One of the things that they've been blessed with is some video that her grandfather shot, some movies, home movies that he shot, well over 70, 80 years ago. And it shows exactly what you think of as a storybook picture in agriculture. Horses and cows and pigs and big wagon loads full of hay. And it's really kind of heartwarming. But it's really a poor representation of agriculture. And in those days, they worked unbelievably hard, manual labor. It's a reason why we saw technology advance in agriculture, is to get rid of some of that hand labor, to get rid of all that work that was required. Yields were not great. It was, as we would think about it today, at that point in time, similar to an organic system. They dedicated about a third of the land that they farmed just to producing feed for the draft animals, for the horses to pull the plows. They were intensive in tillage, right, because that was their weed control. They worked the ground extensively both before the season and as a method of weed control during the season. And so we think sometimes back kind of reflectively of like, oh, those were the good old days. Well, the good old days really actually weren't that sustainable. In fact, the yields in that era was about 40 bushels per acre. And the farm today, still in the family, is raising typically for corn. I say corn, when I said 40 bushels an acre, that was for their corn yields. The farm today raises about 240 to 260 bushels a year on average. So huge impact in terms of productivity, huge impact in terms of efficiency. And that's not always celebrated in agriculture, but it's a huge step in terms of what technologies has provided. There's been a lot of talk today, and one of the great things about going towards the end of the session is you hear a lot of other things, a lot of other speakers say a lot of things that you were maybe going to say, and that kind of helps, right? Lots of discussion around climate smart benefits of agriculture, reducing tillage, reducing inputs, whether those be fertilizer inputs, using programs like cover cropping. These are all what we would consider climate smart farming practices. They have a benefit, as Dr. Honeycutt showed earlier, in terms of the ability to sequester carbon. They have water quality benefits. They have the ability to prevent soil loss into the environment, which also provides a water quality benefit. So these are pretty simple to understand, right? And all farmers, I think, intuitively understand them. So why don't farmers implement these practices across all of their operations? What's the barrier? And again, I think Nick showed some of the barriers there, Dr. Gazer earlier. Hey, there's a knowledge gap sometimes, right? How do I adapt these new practices? There's risk. There's a financial, maybe potentially disincentive. It's going to cost me more, and if nobody else is paying for it, everybody expects me to do it. Why would I do that? And there's also, I think, a little bit of a cultural issue here. Farmers and farm families typically, and I'm speaking very much from a Midwestern, maybe a North American perspective, multi-generational. You kind of have to kill off the previous generations before you can start to make changes, right? And so if you think about a grandfather and a father and a son in a farming operation, who makes the decisions? How much of this, in terms of just agronomic practices, do farmers do that are simply because that's the way we always did them, that's the way Granddad did it? Great-great-granddad broke the prairie open, right? And so he'd be rolling over in his grave if we quit tilling the ground. I mean, these are actual challenges that we face. But the one that I really want to focus in on is that financial barrier, right? If a farmer wants to plant a cover crop, if a farmer wants to convert to no-till, and we recognize that there are benefits to doing that, and there's a great text box in the very last page of your book or your program booklet from TNC that says, hey, for every 1% of the cropland acreage that we switch over to these climate smart farming practices, there's a $226 million benefit to society. But today, that benefit doesn't accrue to the farmer, at least not in a way that they feel like they should be participating. So that's the real challenge that we really said, how do we set out and look at this challenge and solve it? Today, if you just kind of look at the current state, right, there's really not a system for accounting and for capturing carbon in agriculture. There's not an incentive to the farmer. And quite frankly, if you can recall back to the earlier part of the 2000s, there was actually an attempt and a fairly significant failure that actually left a lot of farmers kind of burned on the idea of participating in a carbon market. Our perspective was, this is something that we can help solve for. We can bring technology to bear. We can bring that to bear in a partnership and say, how do we actually start to quantify how much soil organic carbon is sequestered? How do we get third parties to actually verify that the work that's been done and the science behind that is valid? And then take that to kind of a future state where the farmer indeed can actually participate in an ecosystem service market for the carbon that they're sequestering on their farms. So in 2016, just rolling it back a few years, we actually sat down and we were in a partnership with TNC and with EDF called the Soil Health Partnership and the National Corn Grower Association. And we looked to our partners and we said, hey, look, one of the really cool things to do would be to try and build out this system. So what would it take? And so just to maybe kind of walk you through kind of the process of kind of what we were thinking. You kind of had to build the framework, right? So how do you take it from an idea of saying, okay, Mr. Farmer, I want you to implement this practice all the way through to the farmer doing the practice, verifying that the farmer did the practice, accounting for the amount of carbon that was sequestered there, and making sure a farmer gets a capture of the value in that system. That required development of monitoring and reporting tools. So you have to set up your inset design documents, and there's a term here, carbon insetting, that maybe you are or aren't familiar with. Typically we've talked about offsets historically, and this is saying within a supply chain, how do you account for your scope 3 emissions, and we consider that an inset. We also had to develop a soil organic carbon capture methodology, right? So how much carbon is actually captured, and how do we actually account for that in a way that, again, is valid? We worked with Soil Health Partnership to engage test farms. So they were working closely with farmers to say, let's learn about these practices, let's share these climate smart farming practices with neighboring farmers. They set up a network of 110 plus farms that grows every year. In addition, we worked with other partners to say, can we scale this out even broader to work with other groups? And then we needed to verify it. And so verifying that through remote sensing was the way that we wanted to look at it, and I'll get into a little bit more detail on this. Oops, sorry about that. So just a brief comment on partnerships. Again, this is something that we really felt very strongly about, but we also recognize that as an industry we have to work together, and we need partners. And so again, you can see the amount of investment just in other partners to bring into this process. It's not a Bayer-owned process. This was developed again through a conservation innovation grant with USDA. So the cool thing is it's really free to the public to use once that framework's been developed. And that's been our goal and our ambition to do that, and to the point that we've actually brought alongside our competitors in the industry to have this conversation about how they could also use it. So just again, a really brief visual of how it works. Setting up some inset design documents, creating the intervention assertion, right? So how much carbon and what are the interventions that the farmers are going to do, verifying that, and then tracking it, right? This seems really easy on the surface when you build it like that, but believe me, it's been the result of a number of years of work. Let's talk really briefly about the carbon. So how do you account for how much carbon? There's kind of two, I think, ways to do this. Number one is you can walk out there with the soil probe, you can stick the soil probe in the ground, you can take samples, take them back to the lab. Extremely expensive, extremely time consuming. That sucks all the value out of the system, right? And so our initial perspective was, let's do some modeling work. There's some very widely creditable modeling tools. We use DNDC. We've actually gone back and compared this with other models, a DayCent model, just to say, do they compare? And the cool thing is they do. We looked at farm scenarios. So do you use no-till? Do you use conventional till? What's your nitrogen management program? Are you applying it in the fall? Are you applying it in the season? Are you planting a cover crop? And if you take all these different combinations, you end up with 640 different farming scenarios, cropping rotation as well. And we actually ran those through this DNDC model. It's 250 million simulations. We did that by soil type, so it's at a subfield level. And what we've been able to do is to generate a really clean number on carbon that's generated based on those practices. And so what you see here is the scope of where we did this work. Again, just because of the volume of data, we did have to limit it. But you can see there, and the scale's pretty small, but you can see there, yellow's good, right? So the brighter the yellow actually means the more carbon that can be sequestered. So if I change my operation from conventional till and no cover cropping and just changed and add those two practices, in some cases our modeling would say, depending on soil type, you can add up to almost a ton, or in some cases 2 tons of soil. I mean, again, it depends on soil type. So you see that by county level, but we actually have the data down to subfield levels. So important to quantify the carbon. Important to verify that if you ask a farmer to adopt a practice, and you incentivize a farmer to adopt a practice, that you can actually verify that the farmer has adopted the practice. And this is where we've worked with a group called Applied Geosolutions. Again, just to use the available satellite imagery, they've developed the algorithms to detect the changes in management on the farm. And so you can see that actually going back to 2006, they can retroactively, because we have the retroactive satellite imagery, we can actually look at change over time, and you see the greening, and that's really just in respect to the amount of cover crops that have been planted. This is the state of Indiana. So giving us that very clear background, that very clear verification process, a very cheap verification process, because again, we're not going out on the farm, we're not sampling, we can do this all remotely. So current status, and I'm wrapping up with just a few seconds to go here, but a really key part of this was to say, hey, look, we've had this collaborative project, but we actually need somebody to say, hey, team, your work that you're doing is actually valid. And so we actually approached Gold Standard and said, can we work with you to to take this through your sustained cert process and certify that this is a good process. And so you guys are maybe a little bit of a lucky group because we haven't spent a lot of time talking about this publicly, but it was a chance that I thought was a great opportunity for us to say we're literally just months away from finalizing the sustained cert process where we would actually be able to release this model, this in-setting framework out into the public. And for those that were interested in it from a Scope 3 emissions perspective in their supply chain, they could adopt this model. And the hope for us is that really going back to where we started, if we're going to ask for that change, if society demands that change, society values that change, we've got to make sure that the farmers don't unduly suffer a burden of the expense. And so that's really what's been motivating us in this process. So with that, I thank you for your time. Would love to catch up later.